Today, I'm here with Michael Hess, who is the Assistant Administrator of the Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, otherwise known as DCHA, in the U.S. Agency for International Development from 2005 to 2009. For reference, DCHA is now the modern-day Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance at the agency. Good morning, Mike.
Good morning, Madison.
Can you please state your full name for the record?
Michael Edward Hess.
And today's date is December 7th, 2023.
It is.
So, Mike, you've done a few interviews now, and so we know that you used to be in the U.S. Army, and then you were a banker. So let's just start with, can you tell us, how did you go from the Army to being a banker to USAID, or USAID?
Well, some people think I can't keep a job, you know. So, my connection and my interest in USAID began in northern Iraq in 1991. That's where we met the first, actually, it was the first DART. First time it was called a DART. They had humanitarian assistance teams they had deployed before, but they came up with the name Disaster Assistance Response Team, DART, for that operation. The head of that DART was Dayton Maxwell, and I met him there. His chief of staff, he called him the chief of staff, he was actually a consultant, was Fred Cooney. And so that's where I met Fred, and that's where he changed my life, got me interested in humanitarian assistance, and all the good work that the international community does to save lives around the world. So
and that was your first experience?
That was I couldn't spell USAID before then, had no idea what an NGO was. I didn't realize what the UN did on a specific level, certainly not on the humanitarian assistance side. All the various agencies and offices of the UN system, all the NGOs, I had no clue. But I got introduced to it there, and from there, I had been interested in getting into this line of work ever since 1991 and working with Fred. So at various times afterwards, as you mentioned, I became a banker, got off active duty after 14 years, 3 months, 22 days, and became a reservist to the
Civil Affairs. So did you not enjoy your time banking?
Banking is not something you enjoy. I mean, I loved my clients. I was a relationship manager as a banker, and that was great for me because I like building relationships with people. And banking is a commodity business. So how does a company choose where it's going to take its banking services? Well, a lot of it has to do in the trust of the relationship with the people in that bank. And so my job was to build those relationships. So I enjoyed that part of banking. The fact that they wanted to know what you had done, my bosses every day, what have you done for my bonus today? Yesterday meant nothing. And so that was not really a fun environment in which to work. But it wasn't supposed to be fun. You know, we were making money. We were increasing shareholder value. And that wasn't necessarily very meaningful.
So you found the humanitarian world to be more meaningful?
I kept looking around. Occasionally I was approached because I knew there were political appointments. I didn't know quite how it worked, but I knew that some of the positions, even in I didn't know what DCHA was at the time, but I know USAID and OFDA, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, had political slots, political appointees that were appointed by each administration, including the head of OFDA. Andrew Natsios had been one, Roy Williams, whom I knew, an International Rescue Committee, he became the head of OFDA. So I knew these people and I stayed in touch with them. And because we started training a lot more with them in our Civil Affairs unit after Provide Comfort, because we needed to know how to operate better so we wouldn't make the same mistakes we made that I made in northern Iraq in 1991. So I knew it was there, and there were a couple of opportunities. One year they called me, a friend of mine called me from there and said, "Hey Mike, the job of the director of OFDA is coming open, and we want you to take it over." And it was November. And the elections were coming in a week. And I said, wait a minute, let me get this right. You want me to quit my job, move my family to DC, and what if this administration changes? Oh, that's not going to happen. I said, can you guarantee that? No. So I could lose my job next week. Well, yeah, you could. So I decided not to go then. But then...
And what year was that?
That one? I don't know. I'd have to go back and look because I can't remember. I can't remember who was the president then. It had to be. It was probably It was probably HW. It was Bush 41. Probably was still in office. So you know, it was a little dicey because it's a political appointment, and the head of the office director for OFTA was, and you served at the pleasure of the president. If the president didn't get reelected, you were gone. So I chose not to take that opportunity. And then one year, 2005, 2004. It was the day before Thanksgiving, Wednesday before Thanksgiving, 2004. Andrew Natsios calls me. I'm sitting at Citibank.
And at this time, who is Andrew Natsios?
Andrew Natsios was the administrator of USAID, so the highest ranking person at USAID. And I knew Andrew. I'd known Andrew on and off. He had worked with Fred. He was working with Fred before Fred came north. He was working with him in Kuwait, dealing with helping the Palestinians. And so I had known Fred or Andrew on and off, and we had talked a number of times. And so he knew he was a civil affairs officer too. So you know, and he calls me and he says, Mike, I want you to come down and I want to offer you the position of head of DCHA. I had no idea what a DCHA was, you know, but Andrew being Andrew, he assumes a body of knowledge. So he starts talking about the job. I want you to be the head of DCHA. It's a great opportunity. We're doing a lot of things. We're trying to bring this bureau together. So then I figured out it was a bureau and not an office. So I'm pretty sharp, right? I figured that right out.
And what are you kind of thinking the job will entail, if you didn't really know what DCHA was?
I thought it was more like on just the humanitarian side of things. But then he started talking about combining Food for Peace, which was one of the offices, and OFTA, so they could work better together, and then bring in democracy and conflict mitigation. And I'm going, conflict mitigation? When did that come in? Well, he had started that office, and so I was getting the impression that this was a conglomeration of offices that dealt on the humanitarian side. And so he said, okay, I need an answer by Sunday.
And what day is it?
Wednesday. And it's Thanksgiving's the next day. So, I mean, there's just a few other things going on in our lives. And my wife, Teresa, and I had sat down 3 weeks earlier to plan out, we used to plan out 5-year segments of our life because we needed I knew at some point I wanted to get over the humanitarian, either through joining one of the NGOs or getting a job opportunity at USAID. So I knew I wanted to do this, and we had talked about it, and she was in the business. But she needed to get...
She was in the Humanitarian Assistance?
She was in the NGO business, okay. And she was more on the civil society development side and the use of technology for NGOs and their missions, so she was more on that side of it. But she was in the business, as we say. So I was married to a tree hugger, and so I became a tree hugger. That was me. There's actually a slide in one of my presentations that Peyton has seen of me hugging a tree. So we'd sat down and said, okay. She was starting grad school at NYU in the God, what school is it? I should know that, but I can't come top of my head. She was going to NYU to get a master's in public policy administration, so how to run a nonprofit. That was the skill set she needed as she wanted to continue to grow in the field. So we said, fine. We were going to have children. We decided that was going to happen. So we figured we would delay my transition. I would stay a banker for at least another 3 years. So, okay, it wasn't the most gratifying job in the world, but it paid a lot of bills. So we decided I was going to stay on, and then Andrew calls. As Teresa likes to say, when mortals plan, God laughs. And God was laughing at us. Here, you thought you had this all planned out? Let's throw this spanner into the, wrench into the spanner. So we talked about it Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and I called Andrew. And what I didn't know was the timing, because he never talked about the timing. If you're a political appointment for OFTA, that could happen in days or hours. I mean, he was connected. He knew Andrew Card, who was President Bush's chief of staff, so he could make that happen through presidential personnel in hours. So we had no idea when I was leaving. I knew a lot of my salary came from a bonus. The bonus decisions were made in January. And if you weren't there, you didn't get your bonus for the last year and all the work you had done. So I'm sitting there thinking, that's a couple of, many thousands of dollars that you're risking to go down. And of course, being a banker paid much better than being a civil servant or a political appointee at USAID. So Teresa and I are debating this. And we're going, what are we going to do now, Ranger? And so the timing wasn't clear. And then I would probably leave, we thought by the first week in December, maybe even, to go down to Washington. So what does that mean about the children or college, But we decided, let's take a leap, we'll say yes. Well, it turns out I was a Senate confirmable position. There are 13 at USAID. So President nominated, Senate confirmed, and that takes a while. It took a long time, as a matter of fact. But I agreed, so that was that Sunday in November. The process starts. I did not have my interview, so the FBI does a background check on you. And there was a challenge in that process because Bernie Kerik had been nominated as the first head of Homeland Security. Remember, this was right after September 11th and the attack and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS. His nomination process did not go well, and some things got exposed during the nomination process in his background. They were questionable, let's put it that way. And so he actually had to withdraw his nomination. And so after that, the background checks that the FBI was doing on the rest of us who were coming up were elevated considerably. And you get this famous question at the end of it, are there any actions you might have taken that could bring discredit upon the President of the United States? So, you got to answer it. You got to figure all that out. So, but I didn't know this was all coming when I had, And so they didn't even get around to interviewing me, the FBI, until February of the next year. Now the bonus decision's been made, payments coming in March, that's good. Teresa's in her second semester of college. Okay, so what's the timing gonna look like? Well, we don't know. You'll do your background check. If you get through that, then we got to go to presidential personnel. They've got to interview, make sure you're ready. So, and all the time I am talking to my handler and presidential personnel, and every conversation they said, you cannot mention this to anyone, only to your wife, not anybody else in your family. You cannot mention. I said, how about people at work? No, you can't. I said, wait a minute, I'm gonna have to leave my job. No, you can't tell anybody, sir. You can only tell your wife, because I said, well, we have to make this choice. Yeah, you can talk to her about it. That was it. So I'm sitting there, and I'm sitting there at my desk one morning, about 7:30, 8 o'clock, and the phone rings, and it's an FBI agent. I'm agent, senior field agent. I'm coming to do your interview this morning for your background investigation for your political appointment.
That morning.
That morning. And I'm sitting there going, holy Toledo.
And are you at work?
I'm at work, sitting at Citibank. So an FBI agent is going to walk into a bank and say, I need to talk to Mike Hess. And you go, how's this going to work? So I called presidential personnel and I said, hey, remember that thing you said about not telling anybody? I said, let's think about this. FBI agent's about to walk into a bank, my headquarters, and ask to speak to my boss. Don't you think I ought to warn her? And he goes, that was a woman, she said. Well, you know, I said, I know what the policy is, but I think we need to warn her so that she's not caught off guard by an FBI agent. Okay, you can tell her, but that's it. And so I went in and talked to her, and we were chatting away and laughing about it, and she was very supportive. She was really good about it. And we're sitting there talking, chatting away, and her phone rings and her assistant answers it. And he knocks on the door, and he says, there's an FBI agent who wants to come talk to you. And he was almost white-faced. And we started laughing. And he couldn't understand why we were laughing about that. But, you know, it was fun. We did a 3.5 hour background investigation.
Wow. And
so then the process starts. I went down to DC to have my interview with presidential personnel probably early March. That went well. And actually, it went very well because the woman who headed presidential personnel had been in Iraq with me and was trying to get staff for the Coalition Provisional Authority and Ambassador Brimmer. And so I had worked with her there. And so at the end of all my interviews, 2.5 hours of interviews of presidential personnel, I said, can I stop by and see Katja? And they say, who? I said, Katja, you know, your boss, the head of presidential, Katja Bullock. You know her? Yeah, we worked together in Iraq. And she said, tell us that, because you didn't ask. So I went down, said hi to her. Things went even better and faster after that. So she sped up the process. I got approved. That means the president then officially nominates me. It went to the Senate because I had to be Senate confirmed. It gets in the calendar. My hearing was scheduled for June. And there were 3 of us on the panel, 2 ambassadors who were going up for positions at the State Department and me for the head of DCHA. So, and that was interesting because that day Senator Lugar was the head chairman of that committee, but they had a vote on the energy package that was going through. And so nobody was there from the committee except for him, and he didn't want to put it off. He says, okay, we got to do this quickly. Your testimony is supposed to be 7 minutes. You only get 5 minutes. I'm going to ask you one question, and that's it. So we had been preparing for this for a while. Okay, so we cut it down to 5 minutes. I get my one question about what do you think about working in the interagency? Because Senator Lugar was very adamant about whole of government. We needed to work better together. USAID, DOD, state. We needed to work better together at this stuff. It was probably one of the findings out of Iraq in 2003. So, you know, it made sense, and I understood that. And I'd been practicing this for now years since meeting Fred in 1981 and implementing it in Bosnia, Kosovo. So I was all on board with that, and he was excited about that. So it was pretty simple. They voted us out of committee that Friday, and the Senate approved it the next Friday, and I was sworn in. And I became, now Teresa at this point is now wrapping up her 2nd semester of her master's program. She is pregnant with twins. Fortunately, I had gotten my bonus, so we were okay on the financial side a little bit, and now we got to move to DC.
And so following your confirmation hearing where you were asked about particularly what you were thinking about interagency work and collaboration, were there certain values or characteristics from your time working in the military and as a banker that you decided you were going to carry over into this new role as the Assistant Administrator of DCHA?
The key to the USAID is its people. USAID doesn't have trucks. It does have some warehouses. We had a lot of stuff in, especially OFDA had a lot of warehouses, and Food for Peace had a couple too. We never got to use them because the food never stayed there. It was gone because there were too many crises around the world. But it's people. What does USAID have? USAID has people, great people. And your job as a leader of a bureau like that is to give them direction, help them, assist them in their jobs, enable them to work better, faster at their jobs, and support them in doing what they're doing. So I had learned that in the Army. So those leadership skills were going to be helpful. As a banker, I was building relationships. Certainly that was the same thing at USAID. USAID works in cooperation with many implementing partners, with other donors, and with the UN, and those are very, very strong relationships. We had the relationship in DCHA with World Food Program. We were the US government representative. I sat on the board for WFP as the head of DCHA, not because of Mike Hess, but because of the position I happened to sit in. But we were responsible for those relationships, and so I knew that was extremely important. So my job is to take care of the people and give them what they needed. We had just had an incident, a DART in Darfur had been attacked, ambushed, and we had a pretty serious casualty in that attack. And so things were...
Actually, before you get into that, let's actually back up just a little bit.
Uh-oh.
And so, what was your role and responsibility as the assistant administrator of DCHA? Just before we get into that specific story.
I led the bureau. So we had 10 offices in the bureau. And the reason Andrew hired me and what he was looking for, he created the DCHA Bureau. Because when you think about it, democracy, conflict, humanitarian assistance, what of those, it's actually conflict mitigation, but it says democracy, conflict, humanitarian assistance. What do those have to do with each other? You say, why democracy and HA? You know, you go, why are those two together? Why is conflict mitigation in there? What's this all about? What was Andrew's? And Andrew's vision was, if you go back to Amartya Sen, who's an economist, development economist, he wasn't from any of them, was he? No. Anyway, Amartya Sen, and Fred Cooney used to tell me this: droughts don't cause famine. Poor governance causes famine. He says, we have droughts all the time in the United States of America. We don't have famine. We have droughts all the time in Europe. We don't have famine. Why do we have famine in poorer, lesser developed countries? It's generally a governance problem. So Andrew's vision was, if we keep treating the symptom and not the cause, we will never break the cycle of this. What we need to do is look at those underlying issues that are in those governments that affect it, that cause those disasters, or why the government isn't able to respond to it. So the idea was conflict prevention, bring in the democracy for the governance, so we can improve the governance capabilities of those, so we can prevent disasters, or at least mitigate them, or give the countries the tools to do it themselves. Why does the U.S. have to do that? Why do we need to spend U.S. taxpayer dollars to do this? So that was one of my charters. Bring the Bureau together as a cohesive unit. At the time, USAID, and some would say OFTA in particular, did not work and play well with others. OFTA is a great organization. They're extremely effective and efficient, and sometimes they forgot they were part of USAID. They definitely forgot they were part of the Bureau, and sometimes they would forget they were part of the U.S. government. You know, but because they were out there to save people's lives, darn it, and that's what we're going to do. Okay, gotcha, and that's great. You want to keep that enthusiasm and focus going, but you're doing it within the construct and a framework of the American government because they pay for it. So you got to kind of remind them of that every once in a while and work and play well with others. So we were trying to bring them together and work and play well with others. The other thing he wanted me to do was to formalize the relationships we had developed with the military. I obviously had a military background. I had worked a lot with the humanitarian relief community over the past, since 1991. So he wanted me to form an office. The Office of Military Affairs is what it was formed at originally, and became the Office of Civil Military Cooperation today. So we started that office when I was there, and he wanted me to do that. So those were my two charters and mandates.
So how did you go about approaching both of those?
So I was curious. Also, one of the things you learn in the military is because they are also a people organization. They got a few other toys like tanks and things like that, but it's a people organization. It's about people. Every day in the Army, you had to account for your soldiers. Every day. You signed a morning report where everybody was. Leave, sick, working, present for duty. You signed a form every morning about where your troops were. I remember walking into the Bureau the first time asking how many people were in the Bureau. And they kind of looked at me like, you what? How many people are in this Bureau? And they said, one guy said, well, there's so many civil servants. Okay. There's so many foreign service officers. There's so many RASas, so many PASas, so many CASas. And I'm going, whoa, what? No, how many people are in the Bureau? We don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? They had no idea. We had 23 separate hiring mechanisms in the Bureau. 23. And they were all under somebody else's control. So no one person in that Bureau was responsible for accountability on our staff. And I go, that's fascinating. I said, we just had a crisis in Darfur. How many people do we have in harm's way today? And they kind of looked at me, what do you mean? I said, well, we just had an attack in Darfur. I know we have people in other conflict areas around the world. How many people do we have in the field today who are in conflict zones? Okay, let's start simply. How many people do we have in Darfur?
And you just had a death in Darfur, right?
No, not death.
Not
She was injured. She lost an eye. And they said, I got 7, 12, 10, 11. Nobody knew. I said, you're telling me we don't know how many people we have in Darfur? How long have we been in Darfur? 5 years, 10 years, 7 years, 12 years. They had no idea how long we'd been there. I said, how do we know when we're going to leave? What do you mean when we're going to leave? Well, what's the end state? What is our goal? What are we trying to accomplish there? How do we know when we've accomplished our task and the mission's complete and we can bring them out of harm's way? Well, we don't know. So I sensed a challenge, here. So we started instituting a couple of things. I said, look, if we have a DART in there, because a DART was pretty consistently, you had somebody who was turning of water and sanitation, you had a food rep, you had shelter, you had all the basic services covered. But say you're working in an operation and you get the water system figured out. Why don't you bring the water person home? Don't leave them there. Say, okay, you've done your job, great, you've handed it off to an NGO or back to the country to take care of. We've trained somebody and it's now sustainable, which is what we're supposed to be there for. Really? Train them to do it themselves. Like Fred Cooney taught us, don't us do it. It's their country. Let them do it. They know how to do it. Teach them better, do it. And then bring that person home. They're not in harm's way anymore. Okay, that's an interesting idea. So I had to start thinking about planning and how you organize your teams and why the people are there and how long they're going to be there. What's the measure? What's your measure of effectiveness when you know you've accomplished that task and mission? They go, well, you know, I said, you got the sphere manual, pull it out. You know, look at that thing and come up, you got measurables right there. That's a good starting point. And they go, oh, okay. And so we started working on that with OFTA. Then I looked at it, said, okay, what's our planning look like for our next disaster? Well, we don't know where it's going to be. Well, how about conflict prevention or democracy? If we're building democracy, where are the humanitarian relief challenges that we need to go in and fix with our institutional building and all this stuff? What do you mean? I says, well, what country are we going to go work on next?
And is this because of a lack of integration within just the Bureau and its different offices?
Absolutely. They didn't talk to each other. So I came up with a program. We couldn't call them priority countries because priorities are set by the President of the United States. Okay, got it. But where are our challenge countries? Where are our focus countries? We call them focus countries. I wanted each of the bureaus to come up with a list of 10 focus countries. And then we were consolidated into a bureau list of the top 10 focus countries. Okay, we did that, got our top 10 list. For example, I said Cuba was having its challenges. And it looked like we might be intervening in Cuba soon because the Castro brothers were about to die. And if you look at the Libertad Act, we wouldn't go in to Cuba and assist in Cuba until the Castros were out of power. It looked pretty clear that Fidel was about to pass, and Raul was not doing well health-wise either. So I said, and do we have a plan for what we're going to do in Cuba? What do you mean? Well, when he dies, we're going to have to go in pretty quickly if we're going to intervene. And they go, really? I said, yes. So we ought to have a plan. I said, I don't know much, but I do know that Fidel will eventually die. And when he does, we better be ready to go. Huh, okay. So I said, that's going to be one of our focus countries. And I said, I want every office in this bureau to set up a working group. And we would have a bureau working group with representatives from each of the offices to come up with the plans and how to work in your sectors for these focus countries. I said, okay. And after about 2-3 months, I would bring the team in, not the office directors, the people who were working on the teams from those different offices of the Bureau. And they would come in and we would have a chat with the senior leadership of the Bureau with them about what they found out. And then I would ask them at the end of it, what was most important for you about this process? What was the least effective? We would do a hot wash. And to a person, they would almost all say, this is the first time I have ever worked with somebody in that office. They had never worked together. And so we were building some, at least the beginnings, the rudimentary beginnings of trying to work together as a bureau to solve these challenges, because then they appreciated the fact that they got different ideas from other offices and different viewpoints, and I hadn't thought about that. So it was a pretty eye-opening experience. So those were some of the techniques that I had to do. It's probably a little more than you wanted to know.
And you did something similar for the new Civil Military Coordination Office that you started, right? With the goal of better cohesion with the military. Can you tell us a little bit about why that was important for DCHA at the time and how you did that?
So that was a little more controversial. There is not, how do I put this nicely? There was not a tendency in the agency, or at least there was not then, to work with the military. It certainly happened on an ad hoc basis. The agency had been working with the military since its formation in 1964. We certainly did it from time to time on disasters. We would have to go to the military for assistance. We had certainly done it in Vietnam, and that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth in the agency.
And what kind of assistance is it that you're getting from the military for DCHA?
For DCHA? In terms of the humanitarian assistance part of it, it was mainly logistics. If you hit a big one like the tsunami of 2000, the Christmas tsunami of 2005 happened right before I came. So we were still in the throes of that when I arrived. So that was a big one because we certainly didn't have the capability to respond worldwide. And that was a worldwide disaster. Certainly in northern Iraq, I had seen how we had to use the military to do the airdrops in the beginning and then some of the logistical support that they provided. When you talk about using the military, it's usually logistics, sometimes communications, but those are the things that they bring to the table. They got some manpower they can throw behind it too. They put up a lot of great tents for us in northern Iraq. So the Marines did. So, they've got some capabilities we can use. But we don't use it all the time, and they're not cheap. They are the most expensive option. But we needed to formalize that process. Some of the leaders of the other bureaus of the institution were not as enthusiastic about that. One of the other things that Andrew had asked me to do was to work and play well with the other bureaus. There were 3 functional bureaus at the time: DCHA, Global Health. I can't remember what the third one was. But then there were the regional bureaus. Well, we had to work together. Often we would just go in for a disaster in a region, but where were we working with the regional bureaus? And so they had set up a joint task force system before I got there. And so there was now a policy that when a disaster was declared, a deputy from the DHA Bureau and a deputy from the regional bureau would be the co-heads of a task force and working groups underneath that task force. And they would meet on a regular basis depending on the need and how bad the disaster was. In the initial phases, the DHA deputy would be the chair of that task force. And at some point it would transition back to the regional bureau. And they had to figure out what that measure was going to be when they hit what level. So there were some processes there, but they weren't being necessarily very effectively used. And so we were trying to work better with the other bureaus as well. So the CivMil part of it really had to be coordinated well because they had to buy into this. And we had to come up with a plan of how we were going to implement this across the agency and across the government. How were we going to work with DoD? So we spent a lot of time talking to folks on the Joint Staff and OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy. We had some friends over there. I had a good friend, Tom Balthasar, that I had worked with as a civil affairs officer. He retired. I went to his retirement ceremony in July of that year in 2006. And I said, Tom, what are you doing after this? And he says, well, I'm going to go build a bathroom for my parents in their home. And I said, no, Tom, what are you doing after you retire? I'm going to go build a bathroom for my parents. So he didn't have a job. I said, well, how would you like to come be the head of the Office of Military Affairs? You're a civil affairs guy. You know how to work with NGOs and IOs. You'd be great at it. Andrew had decided that the head of the Bureau was going to be a Foreign Service officer, and the deputy was going to be a political appointee.
Is the head of DCHA?
No, the head of OMA, Office of Military Affairs. He wanted a Foreign Service because he knew that inherently the Foreign Service would fight this. They would not be on board because many of them had memories back to Vietnam days. So, okay, but I brought in Tom Balthasar and I said, I think we need to do this because I think our harder sell is going to be getting the combatant commanders to take a person from USAID and put them on their staff. And we will have a hard time on the Joint Staff and in OSD policy getting people embedded there. And he said, okay, I'll talk to Tom. And he interviewed him. We went in together, Tom and I did. We had a hour and a half chat with Andrew, and he agreed at the time to make him the head. And then we began the process of, we developed the concept that we needed a senior development advisor, a senior foreign service officer in each of the geographic combatant commands except for Northern Command. We didn't think we needed one in the United States of America. It was a pretty risky effort, but we did it anyway. So, and we started with the European Command because we had a very good relationship with European Command. And then we started looking at the Joint Staff. So we went around to all the geographic combatant commanders, met with them, came to the concept. They were all enthusiastic. I mean, these people knew. I mean, you're talking, you're getting about ready to start the surge in Iraq. So things were pretty intense. Afghanistan was still going on. But these geographic combatant commanders knew that the end state for these operations and these missions was not a military one. It was a civil military one. And if we didn't work as a whole of government, we were never going to get out of this mess. The geographic commanders understood that to a person. Some of their staff didn't. There are always troglodytes out there. So they got it. We put the first one in UCOM. Then we did, I think we did PACOM after that. CENTCOM was pretty easy because we already had people down there. We had people working them because they were the combatant command working for the major operations that were going on. So that one was pretty easy too. We just transitioned the title, and General Dempsey, Marty Dempsey, was the deputy down there at the time, and so he and I worked pretty closely on that one. So it went pretty well, but we had to sell it then. We came up with the policy. We actually came up with a SIMMIL policy and wrote it. And I presented it to Andrew, actually Tom and I did, and the people who had written it, I wasn't going to take credit for it. They wrote it. They went in and met with Andrew about it. And then he walks in one morning to a senior staff meeting. Number 2 on the agenda is adoption of the SIMMIL policy for the agency. He gets up after the first item on the agenda, says, I got to go. Mike's going to talk to you now about the SIMMIL policy and how we need to adopt it for the agency. And if you don't like it, leave. Thank you, Andrew. That was a really great introduction. And he walked out. He walked out of the room. So I'm sitting there with all these bureau heads going, hi, guys.
We're adopting this, even if you don't want to.
Yeah. Bit of a hard sell, but you know, but it went, it worked, and it was reluctant and it was hard. Because where do you get the senior development advisors? How do you get people to go out of, anytime you take somebody out of their primary role in an organization and you have them doing something tangential to that, it has impacts on their career. Has major impacts on their career. We had seen that in the Army. We had gone through the whole thing on jointness and how we had to serve in a joint billet. And doing that was like pulling teeth from the senior leadership on down. We ran into this. I knew we were going to run in. Tom and I used to talk about this because we had seen what had happened in the Army and the Navy and the Air Force.
Did you find ways to mitigate it for senior development advisors at combatant commands?
No. We proposed some, but the leadership of the agency wouldn't implement them. So in the military, in order to get promoted to a flag rank, that's either admiral or general, you have to have served successfully in a joint billet for over a year, a joint billet. And so that's when the geographic combatant commanders started getting the best and the brightest of the military services. Before, they would always send them somebody who was available, and yeah, it's a geograph. We don't care what those guys think. Now they were getting the best and brightest, because if they were going to get them promoted, they had to have served in a billet either on the joint staff or in a geographic combatant command. That was implemented by Congress because they were not implementing the Goldwater-Nichols Act. So I went to the administrator And I told her, Andrew was gone by then. It was now Henrietta IV, and I said, we need to ensure that we write into our promotion criteria that people need to have served in we didn't call it joint assignment. It was like a interagency, an interagency assignment in order to get promoted into the senior foreign service. And she says, no, Michael, we don't have to do that. We'll take care of our people and we'll make sure they have their credit. No. And on the first 2 promotion boards after we put SDAs in the field, none of those SDAs were selected for promotion. None of them.
And the SDA role is for foreign service officers?
Yes. And they were on the cusp of becoming very senior foreign service. So I was upset. You thought I was going to say something bad, didn't you?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So I was pretty upset. I was really upset about that. It didn't, because think about it. Who writes their evaluation? Their evaluation's written by a 4-star, which is pretty freaking amazing. And most of the combatant commanders embrace this. I mean, Jim Stavridis down at Southcom, it's like a kid in a candy shop. He would take that senior development advisor all over, and UCOM was still covering Africa then. They would take them all over Africa because they were having a hard time dealing with Africa and didn't understand it. I mean, think about the European commanders. Got everything from Norway to South Africa. You don't understand all those things, and certainly not in Africa. And so having an SDA there, they thought, this is great. Now they're getting evaluated, these SDAs are, by a 4-star general. Holy Toledo, And they were all getting rave reviews. But the promotion board at USAID would look at it. This is out of agency evaluation. It's meaningless. Right. They don't understand our standards. They don't understand our people. It was horrible. I was really disappointed. But it's come a long way. We had to talk to...
And there was nothing you were able to do to change that at the time?
Nothing.
Okay. But you did stand up the CMC office.
We did.
And did you notice a change in civil relations, particularly within DCHA, after following that?
Absolutely. We started working pretty closely because we brought in liaison. So we put SDAs out, senior development advisors, out with the COCOMs, and they gave us liaison officers. So then we had somebody on the staff who could talk directly to the staff in the field. And we debated sending them out to the regional bureaus, to places like the AFRICOM one with the Africa Bureau, or the UCOM one with the European Bureau. But we decided not to because we wanted it one-stop shopping. Because more than just the regional bureau needed to deal with those liaison officers. So we kept them consolidated in the time at OMA and eventually CMC. And they still are. They're still there. The SDA offices went from 1 person. Initially, then a deputy was added. And now they have a staff of sometimes 3 or 4 people. The AFRICOM Bureau in particular, the AFRICOM Command, extremely enthusiastic about the senior development advisors, and then their staff maybe 4 or 5 people now, because they became more integrated across all of the joint staffing billets, whether it's personnel, logistics, but mainly with planning and operations. So it's been a pretty big success, and now it is considered to be a stepping stone for promotion. So it's worked out, but I was extremely disappointed.
Okay. And I know during your time as the assistant administrator, you also championed the creation of a new care program for staff. Why did you do that, and what did that look like?
That's a great question. As I mentioned, I was very concerned about our people and taking care of our people. I was very concerned. I knew, not intimately, but I knew we had challenges with how benefits happened. Every one of those separate mechanisms had different benefits. Some, their leave got carried over, some they didn't. Some had health care benefits, others didn't. we had Christmas Eve, no, New Year's Eve in 2008. No, that's wrong. Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, 2007, New Year's Day, 2008. We had 2 people killed in Sudan, in Khartoum. They were ambushed coming home from the New Year's Eve party. Both of them were shot and killed. One was the driver, and John was there. He was killed. I was notified immediately. I said, well, have we notified the family? I got silence. Have we notified the family? Do I need to call the family? Silence. So what's wrong? We don't know about his family. We did not have records on our staff about who their next of kin were. So we had no idea if he had parents, siblings, spouse, nothing in our files. I was, needless to say, unhappy. Over the course of the process, we sorted it out. We found out he did have a sister who was still alive. His parents had passed. So we notified her, started to make the arrangements with her about bringing the remains home. The other gentleman was a local national. We found his family. That's a lot. Obviously, the mission there. And we contacted his family and made sure all the arrangements were done. It was handled well. It was easier. Eventually, John, we had the appropriate actions were taken so that his family got some condolences and were treated respectfully. So it kind of worked out. But what it pointed out to me was these differences in the hiring mechanisms were a problem. Not just me from an accountability point of view and my rigid military background of accounting for people and Mike being a jerk. You know, it wasn't about that. I also started to look into, as we were looking at this, I was concerned about the benefits that our staff had across the board. So I had the accountability issue. If you don't even know how many people are in your bureau, how do you know what your resources are? I was concerned because we had these people in high risk areas who were under a lot of pressure. People on darts are exposed to very, very traumatic incidents. And then they come back home and we just let them go back to work. And we don't evaluate them. And I had seen that in my own case. When I came home from Bosnia in 1996, we were out processed because I was in a reserve unit at then Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty. I was out processed, and during the out processing process, they gave us a psych evaluation. And I decided to fill it out honestly. It's a little bubble thing, you write the little, color in the little. Gave it to PFC. He had a little grid he put over the top of it. He added up the number. He looked up at me. He looked down at the number. He moved the little answer sheet, added it up again, looked up at me, moved it a little bit the other way. He said, "Sir, can you go sit in the corner?" I had failed the psych eval. I had failed it. So I went over and sat in the corner. After about 10 or 15 minutes, a captain comes out. And he says, we get a lot of false positives on these things. We're going to send it off to Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. Going, why there? The Army is sending off my psych eval to Ramstein Air Force Base. Yeah, sure, okay. Never heard from him again. I had failed my psych eval, and the Army didn't care at all. 3 days later, I'm home. I go back to the office at work. I'm sitting in Citibank This guy calls up and starts yelling, first day back, he starts yelling and screaming, you have to set up this lunch with this client. This is the most important lunch we're gonna have. I wanted to scream at the guy, do you know there's places in the world where people don't even eat freaking lunch? Because they don't have any food? How important is a lunch? You know, come on, get real. But I didn't, you know. But obviously I was on the edge. But nobody in the Army knew that. And so I was relating that to my staff and saying we need to take care of our people. We shouldn't let them come back. Do we evaluate them when we go out? No, we don't. State Department did. Anybody who comes home from the State Department from a hazardous area, a conflict zone, is evaluated by the medical staff at the State Department. I said, why aren't our people? Well, they can ask to be if they're a foreign service officer. They can ask? No, that's wrong, because I knew that people in these conditions don't recognize that they're in trouble. I said, we got to get this. And so we said, okay, now all the foreign service, now we didn't have that many foreign service officers in our bureau. They were mainly contractors. I said, how about them? Well, it's not covered in their contract. I said, what? How can we do that? We send people in harm's way and we don't even care enough about them to give them the benefit of an evaluation when they come home? I said, it's bullshit. So we took money out of our bureau. Probably shouldn't have said bullshit, but okay. It was BS, that's how I said it. So I said, we took money out of our budget and created what we called the CARE program, where we wanted to know what every member of our bureau had in terms of benefits. So I was concerned about the level of benefits for our staff, and so we took some money, we developed a database, and so we started writing down everybody in the bureau, collecting information from everybody, regardless of their hiring mechanism. We put it into a big spreadsheet so we could see, and for the first time, and this was, you know, I'm almost about ready to leave now. I'd been there that long. I knew how many people were in the bureau. And I knew what kind of benefits they had. And so we started developing we developed a policy that when people came back from a DART, disaster assistance response, which is often traumatic, or they came back from an OTI mission in the field, which was a transition, which is often very stressful and they're under a lot of pressure, or if they've been in a hazardous zone, they had to be evaluated by the specialists at the State Department, just like anybody else.
The specialist at the State Department, is that right?
You betcha, because we didn't have our own. The other thing we did is we noticed so you asked people why they didn't go ask for help. There was a block on your security clearance form that said, have you ever sought psychological help? Have you ever been treated by a psychiatrist or a psychologist? I can't remember which one the block was. And it was on the form. It was on our form for our security evaluation. It was in the military too. So it was a block. And if you, and the urban legend was, if you check that box yes, you would not get a security clearance. Which meant in USAID, you didn't have a job. So I said, whoa, time out here, sports fans. That's not accurate. And I told my staff, the key staff, I said, that's not true, because I have checked that box. I had 2 years of therapy when I came back from Bosnia. I was going through a divorce, I was going through a lot of stuff. I had 2 years of therapy and psychiatric help, and and I answered that question honestly every time. And they looked at me like, what? I said, yeah. I said, you gotta do that, There's nothing wrong with having help. We all need help. I especially needed a lot of help. But and so we had an all hands meeting, and I told the entire bureau, well, not all of them, because they don't all show up, but those who showed up, I told them, I said, you feel free to do that, and you should do that, and you should get help if you think you need it. Even if you don't think you need it, you should get help, because it's important for you and your mental health and your ability to work and serve, and you'll be more effective. And I told them I did it. I told them I went through 2 years of therapy. And I said, you can't do this shit on your own. And they all looked at me like, what? And I cried in front of the whole bureau. So, you know, but that's okay. You can do that too. But we did. So out of that program, we started the care program. And it eventually went off to the whole agency. So I'm pretty proud about that little aspect of taking care of our staff and our people.
Absolutely. And did it ever change from using State Department's resources to hiring mental health professionals within USAID?
No, I don't think it ever did. It really didn't need to, as long as we had access to them. I mean, I didn't care where they came from, and we shouldn't have. There's no point in duplicating resource allocation. I don't know if, I haven't talked to anybody about that lately. I gotta ask Karma. Karma Lively was the one who really pushed hard on this. Karma and Susan, who was in PPD, they were the two who spearheaded this, and it was a great program. And within 6 months, we had it up and running. And I knew how many people we had in the bureau, what their benefits were, and what we needed to do to take care of them. So I thought that was pretty important. It's unfortunate we had to have 2 people killed to do that, and it shouldn't have ever been that way, but it became the motivating factor for the process. So yeah.
Mike, it's well known that there are many challenges within the humanitarian assistance profession. You've hit on some of them today, but from your perspective in your career, what would you say have been the hardest part of this profession for you?
That's a good question. I mean, anytime you do this business, you see a lot of people suffer. So the hardest part for me was, you know, you send people out to stop the dying, save lives. I mean, that's the mission. Return the conditions. So that can be very gratifying. But in the process, you have sent them out to see some really horrible things. Really bad things, and it affects them, and most times they don't know it affects them. And the hardest part for me was I didn't feel I was taking adequate care of them, that we didn't prepare them well enough to go, because you never can, or when they came back that you didn't take care of them well enough. And I know that people still have problems when they come back, and they're going to. You know, I think having put the systems in place, that can be gratifying, but you know that it's not working for everybody, and you are responsible for sending them out there. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's never easy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's hard.
Yeah. And what about the most rewarding part?
Oh, it's working with the people. I had the best job in the world. Being the head of DCHA was great. Great people, great mission, had a lot of money. We had big time money. We had the most money in the agency except for the Middle East Bureau, because they were doing Iraq and Afghanistan. But their money was phony money. We had real money. We were helping people around the world. It was the greatest job in the world.
And what advice would you give to youth that are looking to enter into this field?
Make a difference in somebody's life. I never made a difference in anybody's life as a banker. But as a civil affairs officer, you know, I did 4 humanitarian relief operations. You know, stopped the dying in northern Iraq, stopped the fighting in Bosnia, and give them a chance to resolve that. Kosovo, met my wife. You know, you can't beat that. You know, but in aid, man, we were doing stuff everywhere. And we were changing people's lives and saving lives and giving them the opportunity. You know, in Zimbabwe and Venezuela, Colombia, you look at those places now and you go, wow, look at Colombia today. You know, and you look at that and you go, well, that's pretty impressive. You know, if you can make a difference in people's lives, do it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time today, Mike. We appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.